5:30, and we'd like to be prompt. We respect your time. I'm going to try to speak up loud enough. We don't have a microphone here that broadcasts out. The microphone here is picking up a feed or recording to the radio. So I'll try to keep the volume up so you can hear me. If I drift down too low, please give me a little signal and I'll pump up the volume if I can do that. I want to thank you all for attending. This is a great turnout. This shows your concern about the city, and we appreciate you being here, taking time from your either busy day or your fun day to be here. My name is Harry Otto. I serve as the Deputy State Auditor to Auditor Tom Schweik. With me today, I have two individuals from the Springfield office. I have Pam Tillery, she's on my far right. She's an audit manager here at the Springfield office. And then next to me is Natalie McNish, and she had the title of in charge. She was in charge of this audit project. I'll probably call on them sometime later to answer some questions that I may not have the answers to, but I feel certain that they're going to be able to answer those questions. In the back of the room, we have one of our folks also from the Jefferson City office from where I am, Jeff Earl, and Jeff's just running the camera there for our own benefit. Jeff is my chauffeur for tonight, for today, and he's also the legislative liaison for our office. We'll go through the findings, the recommendations. We'll have time for questions, and we'll welcome your questions this evening. This audit, these audit findings are intended to be constructive and provide guidance to improve the city. This was what we call a petition audit, as you probably know. And a petition audit is really democracy in action. It allows the citizens, if there are enough of them, who are willing to sign their name on a petition, to basically order the auditor's office to show up and do the audit. We're required by statute to come here if you've had the number of signatures required, and I believe it required 200 signatures, and we had slightly more than that, where that was certified by the county clerk that they were qualified signatures. So we entranced and began the field work in October of last year. When we did this audit, we also did the audit of the Forsyth Municipal Division, and that was a report we issued earlier this year. That report indicated the municipal division, we rated them good. We had one small finding that certain procedures should be involved. If you're interested in looking at that report, you can pick it up off of our website. It's easy to go to our website and pick up all the reports that we do, and that one will be there. We considered all the concerns that were raised by the chief petitioner and by others. And ultimately, though, the auditor's office, it's up to the auditor's office to use its professional discretion as to how deep to look, how many places to look, how much time we have to look at the issues that were raised. So some of the concerns resulted in no findings. So you won't see anything in here if there was no finding, no recommendation. These are where we did have findings and do have recommendations. And after we get involved in an audit, sometimes it leads us to places that we didn't expect to go. So sometimes we readjust the scope of the audit after we've begun and looked at what we find. The period audited was the year ended August the 31st of 2011. And we would note any items that popped up after that. We were here through field work February of this year. So if things would pop up after the year end, here, we would certainly note those issues would have come up. When we first started, we sort of based the estimate of the fee on the size of the city's finances, of what kind of money runs through the city on an annual basis. And we had roughly determined that the estimated cost would be somewhere between $35,000 to $50,000. It turns out that it's not that much. We think that the actual cost incurred and expended will be approximately $25,000. It's going to be below the minimum that we anticipated. And part of that is because we found less than perhaps we might have anticipated, and part of it is due to the excellent cooperation received by the employees and the elected officials as we conducted the audit. If things get testy, time takes more time, and that didn't happen here. So we're appreciative of the cooperation that was shown by the elected officials as well as the staff, employees. The mayor and the current board of aldermen have accepted and agreed to implement most of the audit recommendations. We hope the focus will be on improving city operations and offerings for the future, and not really laying blame and looking back at the past or worrying much about the past. There is a citizen summary included with the report that you picked up on your way in. And the citizen summary is something that the new auditor, Tom Schweig, started when he came into office a year ago. He felt, and I would agree with this, that some of the audits are just a little bit too technical to understand unless you really have to spend a lot of time on them. So a citizen summary has been developed. You'll see it on the front of the audit that you picked up. And it brings the terms and information down to the kind of man on the street level, and you can dial in a lot quicker and understand much sooner what happened, what was found, and what needed to be fixed. The overall rating, that's another thing that Tom Schweig brought in, was a sort of a classroom rating, you might say, or a teacher's rating. On this audit was fair. It's a step below the good. The goods are hard to come by, and excellence are almost impossible. But we rated the operation of the city fair. The report contains several findings, one or more findings that require management's immediate attention, and/or the city has indicated several recommendations will not be implemented. In addition, if applicable, several prior recommendations have not been implemented, but I don't think it's appropriate here. That was the way we determined what a rating is, based upon the prior reports as well, if there were any. The audit report has findings in 8 different categories, and we'll dial through those here shortly. And those 8 categories resulted in 22 recommendations. Some of these categories only had 1 or 2 recommendations, some had multiple recommendations. So what I plan to do is run through those, and I'll go through about the same order that you have in front of you, and we'll go through these, and then we'll take some questions. And once again, if I drift off or drift down too low on my volume, please give me a nod or a signal. The first finding dealt with the financial condition of the city. The general fund was in poor condition, and the Board of Aldermen failed to monitor the budget and cash balances. The general fund balance decreased by 55% during the 3 years ended August the 31st of 2011. It dropped from about $330,000 to about $149,000. And only 58,000 or about 59,000 of the balance was unrestricted. So much of the balance that was there was a restricted balance, couldn't be used for general operations. The Board of Aldermen is not using available information to monitor cash balances and the financial condition of city funds. And I'm going to say at times, is not using, because at the time we were there, they were not using. That doesn't, you'll see in the recommendations in many cases where we made recommendations, where recommendations have been implemented, it may not be fair to say the city is. I should be saying in some cases the city was, but this was sort of written before the findings were all implemented, so I don't want to mislead you there, but that's sort of audit speak that I'll be using at times. Annual budget's not accurate, and the board does not approve all expenditures and transfers. The city spent $28,500 to purchase property adjacent to City Hall, but a related bond issue failed, and the city has no alternative means to finance the development of this property, and it remains vacant. Our recommendation under finding 1 was that the board closely monitor and take necessary steps to improve the financial condition of the general fund, to perform immediate and long-term planning, maximize revenues, closely monitor expenses, review accurate budgets and lists of expenditures, and develop plans for utilization of purchased property. The response we received from the city was, excuse me, the board is aware of the financial condition and has been taking steps to improve it, encouraging new businesses and expansion, reducing expenses, and the board predicts that the city will be back in the black this year. That's really the kind of response we like to hear when we make a recommendation. They accept the recommendation and take action. Under finding 2, it deals with the real estate purchases. The city incurred unnecessary costs by purchasing unneeded real estate in 2008. In October of 2008, the city spent $160,000 to obtain a parcel of real estate, including a house, in order to obtain an easement for a future road. It's unclear why the city purchased the property instead of just acquiring or purchasing the easement. The city lacked the funding source to build a road, so the road has not yet been constructed. The city was unable to sell the house and the remaining property, so it decided to rent the house. It now rents that house for $700 a month. Has a tenant there that pays $700 a month. The city has spent over $8,000 to repair, maintain, and insure that property. As of October 2011, the city has incurred over $24,000 in interest costs on the borrowed money, and it borrowed the money when it actually had a balance of over $220,000 in a fund that could have been used to purchase it rather than use borrowed money to purchase that property. Our recommendation under finding 2 was that the city develop plans for utilization of the property purchased, ensure associated costs are considered, better plan future real estate purchases and projects. The response from the city was the board inherited the house issue and also questioned the soundness of the decision, but has rented the house to minimize costs until the housing market rebounds. The third finding dealt with restricted revenues. The city has not established adequate procedures to ensure restricted monies are expended only for intended purposes, and that salaries and other expenditures are properly allocated among funds. There are several recommendations under finding 3. The first one, 3.1, deals with tracking and recording restricted revenues. The city is not properly tracking and recording various restricted revenues. The state motor vehicle related revenues are not accounted for properly because they are deposited into the general fund, and balances of the restricted funds are not tracked. Article 4, Section 30 of the Missouri Constitution requires motor vehicle revenues be expended for street-related purposes only. The police officer standard training, and we abbreviate that as POST, and the law enforcement in training, LET fees, are deposited into the general fund, and revenues, expenditures, and balance of these monies are not tracked. Section 488.5336.2 of Missouri Revised Statutes requires POST and LET funds fees to be used only for training law enforcement officers. So we had a recommendation under 3.1, determine the amount of the restricted monies in the general fund, establish separate funds or a separate accounting for these monies as required by state law. The city's response was, we will establish expenditure accounts to track these restricted monies. We had another recommendation at 3.2, and that dealt with the allocation of salaries and expenditures. Here was the issue. The city allocates the salaries of all police department employees, the city clerk, the building inspector. Those three, 85% of their salaries are allocated to the general fund and 15% to the park fund, but there's no documentation as to how that calculation was arrived at, or the tracking of time of these individuals to see if the allocation is correct. The city has no documentation to support the allocation of debt service payments related to a 2003 purchase of property used as a park and for water and sewer facilities. A portion of the remaining debt should be allocated to the utility funds rather than the park fund. Our recommendation under 3.2 was to ensure salaries and other expenditures are properly allocated to the applicable city funds and is supported by adequate documentation. The city's response to our recommendation 3.2 was currently monitoring staff time spent in the different areas, and we will continue to fine-tune allocation. The city prefers to continue the debt service allocation on the property since only 4 years left are left on the retirement of that debt. We might talk about that later. Under finding forward, this dealt with the utility controls and procedures. We identified significant weaknesses in the control procedures related to the utility system. And under the issue of water usage, the city does not typically reconcile gallons of water billed to customers to the gallons of water pumped each month. And significant differences are not investigated, so unauthorized use or leaks could go undetected. In fiscal year 2011, the city only performed reconciliations in June and August. The water pump exceeded water billed by 900,000 gallons in June of that year, and the water pump versus the water billed in August, the water pump exceeded water billed by 2.8 million gallons. Those percents are 11% difference in the month of June, 28% difference in the month of August. The city does not track city water usage, which impairs the ability to perform this reconciliation. So some of that 11%, some of that 28% was really gallons used by the city, but it's not being tracked. The U.S. Environmental Protection Agency says a goal for the water industry for unaccounted for water is 10% or less. I've just given you numbers of 11%, 28%. Once again, the city didn't track its own usage, so it would be something less than that. Maybe one of those 2 months would be within that threshold of 10%, but probably not the other one, which used the 28% difference. So our recommendation under 4.1 was that the city investigate significant differences between gallons of water pumped versus gallons of water billed, track the city usage on a monthly basis, and the city's response was the city has implemented these recommendations. Under reconciliations, same area, since May of 2011, the city has not performed monthly reconciliations of total amounts billed, payments received, and the amount unpaid for utility services. Reconciliations are needed to ensure accounting records balance, transactions are properly recorded, and errors or discrepancies are timely detected. Our recommendation under 4.2 was to perform monthly reconciliations, amounts billed to amounts collected, and delinquent accounts, and retain adequate documentation thereof. The city's response was the city has implemented this recommendation. 4.3 dealt with adjustments, and the independent approval is not obtained and documented for adjustments to the utility system, and the justification and reasons for the adjustments are not adequately documented. The city clerk, the utility clerk review amounts due each year and write off account balances determined uncollectible. The utility clerk who authorizes adjustments to utility customer accounts also prepares utility bills and posts the adjustments. Our recommendation there was to require independent review and approve all utility system adjustments and retain adequate documentation thereof. The response was the city has implemented this recommendation. Under utility deposits, we said controls and procedures over utility deposits need improvement. The utility deposits posted to customer accounts are not reconciled to the deposit payable balance in the general ledger. And as of October 31, 2011, deposits payable was $2,601 less than the list of deposits from the utility system. The list of utility deposits was incomplete and inaccurate. At least 7 deposits were not included on the list. 52 deposits had been refunded but were still on the list. 92 deposits should have been refunded but were still being held, and 13 deposits should have been applied to outstanding balance. The city does not consistently require deposits from owners of rental properties when the rental property is vacant if utility services are still in use. So our recommendation under this area, recommendation 4.4 was, city prepare monthly lists of utility deposits and reconcile to a utility deposits payable balance, investigate and resolve discrepancies, ensure deposits are refunded or applied to outstanding balances in accordance with city ordinance, and require deposits for all active accounts. The city's response was the city is working to reconcile deposits from the old system, and a new system does this automatically. The final item in area 4 was with respect to delinquent accounts. The city does not add the 5% late penalty to delinquent accounts as required by the city ordinance 238. Our recommendation was that the city assess penalties for delinquent accounts in accordance with the city ordinance, and the city responded. An ordinance was revised earlier in the year. A new computer system applies this penalty automatically. We're on accounting controls and procedures, finding 5. We said that receiving, posting, and depositing procedures need some improvement. The receipt slips are not issued for some monies received at City Hall. The method of payment and the actual amount received not always documented on utility stubs. The method of payment is not documented on receipt slips issued by the park attendant for park fees. Checks are not always restrictively endorsed on receipt. Utility shut-off, turn-on, and certified bill fees charged and collected by the city are not posted to the utility system. Receipts are not always deposited timely and intact. We did a audit staff cash count on November the 1st of 2011. We found 15 water deposits received between the October 12th and 31st. They total about exactly $750. They were not deposited until November the 3rd. The city officials often cash city checks from utility collections. There was an example of a $250 city check that was cashed from the utility collections on June 28th of 2011. That was used as a prize money for the Chamber of Commerce barbecue cook-off. Our recommendation under 5.1 was city document actual amount paid, method of payment, and issue receipts for all monies received. Restrictively endorse checks immediately upon receipt. Post all turn-on, off charges and payments. Deposit all monies timely and intact. And the response was the city is implementing that recommendation. Under 5.2, business licenses, we noted that business licenses were not pre-numbered, receipt slips not issued for these monies, and no procedure to reconcile business licenses issued to fees collected and amounts deposited. So we recommended that the city use pre-numbered business licenses, account for the numerical sequence, reconcile licenses issued to fees recorded and deposited. The city responded they were implementing that recommendation. Final recommendation under item 5 was dealt with bank reconciliations. The city does not perform complete bank reconciliations, and as of at August 31st, 2011, the general fund checking account balance was $104 short of the book balance. Interest earned on 2 certificates of deposit totaling $1,248 was not recorded in the accounting records. Our recommendation in 5.3 was prepare complete bank reconciliations for all bank accounts and resolve any differences in a timely manner. The city's response was they're implementing that recommendation. Finding 6 dealt with expenditures. Weaknesses were noted in controls and procedures over expenditures. First item was in the bid process. The city bid policy was not followed for several purchases. The procurement policy requires the city to advertise and solicit written bids for items or services costing more than $2,500 and solicit quotes for items or services costing more than $1,000 but less than $2,500. Bids were not solicited for trash and recycling services, and that's about a $200,000 annual. Is that an annual or that's annual? They were not solicited for a sewer water sampler or for park paint. The city officials said verbal quotes were obtained, but no documentation was retained for bulk fuel, which was over $42,000, and road salt was $2,205. City officials said the sewer pump purchase, $44,675, was a sole source purchase, but that was not documented. So our recommendation here is that the city solicit bids for all applicable purchases in accordance with the city ordinance and maintain sufficient documentation. The response was the city is implementing that recommendation. Finding 6.2 dealt with the approval process. The approval process for expenditures and transfers is not adequate. The list of bills provided to the board for approval each month is not complete, and this list is not compared to approved invoices and actual checks written. An example is in December 2010, the list did not include non-payroll expenditures totaling $74,516. The board does not review or approve transfers between bank accounts, and during fiscal year 2011, the city clerk made 53 transfers totaling $811,345 without board approval. Our recommendation here was to ensure the list of bills provided to the board for approval each month is complete and establish adequate review and approval procedures for transfers. The city has implemented this recommendation. Under item 6.3, we deal with the fire call pay. During calendar year 2011, the fire chief was paid additional compensation totaling $1,158 for responding to fire calls. It's unclear why responding to fire calls is not within the fire chief's normal job duties. City Ordinance 248 said duties of the fire chief include organizing, coordinating, and directing the use of manpower and equipment at the scene of a fire. An independent review and approval of fire call payments to the fire chief is not performed and documented. At the end of each month, the fire chief prepares a worksheet from incident reports to document how much should be paid to each volunteer and himself for responding to fire calls. Our recommendation here was to compensate the fire chief in accordance with the city ordinance, and the city's response was that has been implemented. The city attorney payments is covered in 6.4. The city attorney was not paid in accordance with the city ordinance, and invoices did not provide adequate detail. City Ordinance 354 provides the city attorney is to be paid a retainer of $300 per month and $100 per hour for special meetings or projects. According to one invoice, the city attorney was paid $150 per hour for a special project. Invoices for additional work during fiscal year 2011 totaled $2,800, only included the date of, let me restate that. Invoices for additional work during fiscal year 2011 totaling $2,800, only included the date the service was provided and the amount requested with no details as to what work was performed or the number of hours worked. So our recommendation under 6.4 was to ensure that amounts paid to the city attorney are in compliance with the city ordinance and require adequately detailed invoices for legal services provided. The city responded that the city has implemented this recommendation. The final recommendation under item 6 deals with supporting documentation. We noted adequate supporting documentation was not maintained for some credit card transactions. Audit staff reviewed March 2011 credit card purchases, found 9 transactions totaling $620 for lodging, food, tools, and training expenses lacked adequate supporting documentation. Our recommendation was for the city to require adequate supporting documentation be obtained and reconciled to credit card billing statements. The city responded they have implemented that recommendation. Under finding 7, deals with payroll, controls, and procedures. Controls and procedures over timesheets and compensatory time records need improvement. Under timesheets, the city entered an employment contract with the former police chief for consulting services not to exceed 20 hours per week in exchange for $1,800 per month. Between June and December of 2011, the former police chief was paid $12,600 under this agreement, but no timesheets or other supporting documentation was required to support these payments. Timesheets were not signed by some employees and were not always reviewed or signed by supervisors to ensure accuracy. Our recommendation under 7.1 was to require timesheets or other supporting documentation to support consulting payments and ensure timesheets are reviewed and signed by the employee and his or her supervisor. The city responded they have implemented that recommendation. Also, under the payroll area, we dealt with 7.2 compensatory time records. Compensatory time information is not always entered into the computerized payroll records, so compensatory time records maintained by the city clerk are not correct. And as of December 15, 2011, the city clerk's records understated compensatory leave balances totaling 105 hours for at least 9 employees. Our recommendation was ensure these time records of city employees are accurate. The city responded it has implemented this recommendation. The final finding, item 8, deals with budgets and ordinances. The city does not comply with state law regarding budgets, and city ordinances need improvement. Under budgets, the city budgets do not comply with requirements of sections 67.010 to 67.040 RSMO. Budgets lack a budget message or a budget summary, actual beginning and ending and estimated ending fund balances. These are items lacking actual revenues and expenditures for the 2 preceding years and the city indebtedness. Those things are needed in the city budget. We recommended that the city ensure the budgets comply with state law. They have implemented or will implement that recommendation. And finally, under budget monitoring, no, I'm sorry, we'll have one after this. Budget monitoring, the budget, this is 8.2. The Board of Aldermen does not adequately monitor budget to actual revenues and expenditures, and so budget amendments for some city funds were approved just before year end, and the city exceeded budgeted appropriations for the water and sewer fund. On July 18, 2011, after expenditures had already exceeded budgeted amounts, the board amended the budget for FY 2011, but even with the amendments, the expenditures exceeded budgeted appropriations for the water and sewer fund by $123,322. The state law requires political subdivisions to keep expenditures within amounts budgeted. We cite the chapter and verse there, 67.040 RSMO. And the state law provides no disbursement of political money should be made unless authorized in the budget. It's at 67.080 RSMO. So our recommendation under 8.2 was that the city properly monitor actual expenditures compared to budgeted amounts, ensure expenditures do not exceed budgeted appropriations. The city said they would implement that recommendation. And finally, under ordinances 8.3, city ordinances have not been adopted setting the specific compensation of the city prosecuting attorney and the municipal judge as required by state law. So our recommendation under 8.3 that those ordinances be established setting this compensation. The city's response was that has been implemented. So that is 1 through 8, 1 through 22 recommendations, 1 through 22 responses to those recommendations. And I'd be happy to try to answer questions if you have some.
So you thought you would revisit the response to the city on 3.2?
There's now we want to do a little history which we talked about earlier today. The purchase by the city of certain property, and that property included a water district and a sewer facility. After it was acquired, it was determined that because of the state law that deals with water districts, the city cannot do that. The city cannot buy a water district. So therefore, that sale was reversed, null and void. That left the city owning that sewer operation. Now help me out with the rest of that in terms of the debt and what's happening there.
There is a portion of the debt related to this utility that was paid with the proceeds from the sale of the water. However, the complete apportionment of the purchase price did not cover all that was allocated to the utility. All of the current debt is currently paid by the park fund, and part of that debt is related to the purchase of the sewer system.
It's a little complicated. I'm glad you brought us back to that. What we said there is that there should be a better allocation, I believe, of the debt payments. That it would be more proper for whoever benefited or whoever owes that debt, in this case the sewer utility fund, to be paying that debt payment. The answer we got when we made that recommendation is, we're only 4 years away, I'm paraphrasing, but we're only 4 years away from paying that off, so we'll just continue to do what we've been doing. Basically, the answer that we have there. Did I say that right? Yes, sir.
Do you have any idea of the amount of the discrepancy? I mean, over the next 4 years,
The remaining debt is, do we have
I do
that?
not have those figures available.
I think we can dial into that if you'd like us to tell you what that number is.
Harry, the original petitioners questioned the city's use of its half-cent sales tax for parks. I know it's kind of addressed in a roundabout way, but it doesn't look like it was directly an issue. Am I misreading anything in that, or what was the reaction to the parks question?
I think a lot of that is covered in Plan 3.
We do say the city needs to be, do a better job in tracking and recording restricted revenues, and the park fund is a restricted revenue. That it can't be mixed with general revenue. There are other restricted funds too, that you pointed out, I think, the law enforcement, two types, the highway money, those monies were put in general funds, and they need separate accounting. a law enforcement fund for the general fund. You can't use those law enforcement training, you can't use the police officer standards training, and you can't use the state motor vehicle revenues. Those need to be separately accounted for, just like the park board money or park funds. They're separate funds, they're for those specific purposes, they can't be mishmashed with general revenue.
Okay, so, sir, what you're saying then is that the percentage that the city is using to pay possibly the salary for the city clerk, the police, or anyone else, is that something independent of that? That's being taken from the park fund money? Is that something different than what we're talking about? Or?
It's closely related. You know, we had an additional finding with respect to the allocation of salaries. In other words, some salaries of the folks there were 85% of their salaries were charged to general fund and 15% to the park fund. And we asked why or how that was determined, and there was, I don't think there was documentation or a calculation to show why it was 85-15. So we asked, our recommendations was that ensure salaries and other expenditures are properly allocated to the applicable city fund and supported by adequate documentation. The city said they were monitoring staff time spent in the different areas. We'll continue to fine tune allocations, and that's where they came back to us and said the city prefers to continue the debt service allocation on the property since only 4 years were left.
I'm still not feeling like I'm getting a direct answer.
Okay.
If I could be more direct with my question, can the city use the park fund money as the petitioner requested to put in the general fund to use for salaries or any other monies that are related to park activities?
Let me tell you the way it should work, and
Okay.
I'm not trying to dodge your question.
Okay.
There ought to be a separate park board fund, park fund.
Okay, so if they take $1 million from the sales tax, cent sales tax for the park, what can that money be used for?
Park-related activities, expenditures. Now, you may have an employee who spends part of their time in the park doing park activities or park
Like a park
expenditures.
attendant?
And part of their time somewhere else. That's where they say they're fine tuning and they're monitoring monitoring staff time. And what a person would do is track their time, not maybe every hour for a year, but for months or sometimes where you get a pattern of X% of their time is spent on park-related expenditures, should be charged. The park ought to pay for that. Part of their time might be spent on sewer or some other area, they ought to pay for that. Whatever we say, whatever that allocation is, it ought to be accurate, and you ought to be able to back it up with somebody actually sitting down and recording their time and allocating the time from place to place.
So if a patrolman, let's just use this as an example, spends 10 hours a week driving through the park, is that an expense that can be charged and allocated out of the sales tax money
Yes.
earmarked for the park?
Yes.
Do we know how much money was misallocated from the park fund to the general fund, and is there any recourse to get money back into the park fund for the general operating budget?
The city wasn't documenting how much time was being spent by the employees, so there's no way for us to know whether the allocation is proper or not. So that's why our recommendation is they need to look at that and reevaluate what needs to happen. And most certainly, if they find out that they've overcharged parks, then they could ask for that adjustment, or if they find, different allocation. But there should be something to support what they're doing, and that's what we didn't see.
So the documentation wasn't there to support
Correct.
what they were using the monies for?
Right.
And what about the debt service payment then? Can that be taken out of the park money to pay for the park
Well,
expense, the
that's
bonds?
who's paying it
or
right now.
The debt on the park?
Any park-related expense is allowable from those monies. So the purchase of a park land is allowable.
The proportion of the debt that was used to buy the sewer facility, we're recommending should be paid from the sewer fund, but it's all getting paid from the park fund.
I got it. Thank you very much.
Harry, can you address the money that was collected from the sales tax and how that money is being spent, if there was good documentation on both sides of that?
Do you restate the question, please?
Money that was collected from the half-cent sales tax on parks, is there good documentation of what was taken in and documentation of what was paid out and how that money was used specifically for parks?
As far as how much money came in, yes, we found adequate documentation. Any related instances where we didn't find significant or sufficient documentation for disbursements would be noted in the report. For example, the salary allocation, the allocation of the debt service payment, and we talk about bidding procedures, any of those that would affect the parks. Obviously, we would like the documentation.
I'd like to go back in history a little ways. I was on the park board for 15 years. We were told by the city that if we would call all the citizens and get the sales tax passed, we'd have a lot better parks and stuff because the parks is being paid for by the citizens of the city who were being charged each month for a little bit, and we felt like the people that use the park that live outside the city, like myself and some, would help generate more income for the park and everything. I'm glad that you're charging the city a smaller amount. We were happy about that, but we don't think you addressed the real question that was brought up. And we were told by the city that if we passed this sales tax, we would have a lot better parks and recreation than what we have. Now, we haven't improved our parks and recreation hardly any at all. Yeah, there is some land purchased that will help in the future, but we also flood almost every, or not every year, but quite often down here. So we got no recreation facilities at all when it happens. The thing that raised a red flag to the park board was the year before the sales tax was passed, we were spending $28,000 for maintenance of the park and $8,000 for benefits. In 2010, and we're just going by the budget. We had the park members was issued a budget each month, and I still have all the budgets. I'm kind of a pack rat. And in 2010, the maintenance on the park had went up to $95,000, and benefits was $38,000. That's what raised the red flag to us that the money's not being used where it should be used to. Now, it looks like you just kind of missed the ball on this thing. I don't see that we're going to get any better parks with what you've recommended. We're still going to have kids no place to play when the park floods. And I'm sorry, that was what brought the whole order about. We didn't know about these other things, and they look like minor things. I mean, everybody can make mistakes. We understand that. And maybe it'll help the city perform better. But we still, I don't think, have addressed the whole question of why the audit was asked for in the first place. Thank you much.
I won't be able to satisfy your concerns here, I'm pretty sure. But I can tell you this, that when we saw that there were allocations between the general fund and the park fund, we asked, how do you determine the allocation? Why is 185%? Why is 115? Documentation didn't exist. So we recommend that you get documentation, that you determine what's a fair allocation of these costs. And the answer was, or the answer to the reply to the recommendation was, we will monitor the staff time and find out what those numbers are and react accordingly. We did make a recommendation with respect to the park fund paying what looks like the debt of the sewer fund. And the reply was, we only have 4 years to go. We'll continue to do what we're doing now. I sometimes tell groups like yourself that we are auditors. We point out things. We do not have badges. We do not have guns. We do not have enforcement authority. We simply report what we see, make recommendations, and hope that most of those recommendations, if not all, are accepted. And we're more forward-looking than backward-looking, trying to fix all the problems of the past, because the fact is, we can't really go back and determine what the percentages were for an individual working in one fund versus another fund. That's virtually impossible to go back and get that number, because they didn't retain the documentation at the time, and it'd be very difficult to, if not impossible, to make that determination. We don't see that as our role in this
Is
operation.
it fair to say that you found in your role, though, that they have misused the funds that are supposed to be allocated for the parks? Is that a
Well,
fair statement?
You know, misused is a relative term.
Well, if it's an allocated funds for the parks and it's being used to pay sewer debt or salaries, I mean, there's no ball fields for the kids to be playing in. You know, there's a lot of issues that these folks went forward with this ordinance, and so is it fair to say that your audit has shown that there's a misuse of funds?
I hate to get trapped by a term, but I would go as far as to say that you can find an instance here of where non-park board expenses were paid with park board dollars. We did not find theft, we did not find fraud, we did not find corruptions where park board money was used for a trip to Vegas. We didn't find that. That's real misuse of money. And I mean, that's an extreme that we didn't find. We didn't find, as I say, theft, fraud, embezzlement. What we did find is what I explained, is that some city dollars that had a flavor to them were used to pay expenses of a different flavor.
Terry, to be blunt, and I know some are gonna take this question the wrong way, but with the audit overall, anything illegal going on at City Hall? Did anyone break any laws as you found with this audit?
Well, you know, our cover letter probably says, it may not use the term illegal, but for instance, paying the city attorney an amount that was different than the ordinance, by a stretch, that was illegal, because the city did not pay the